Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Frontline Dispatches on Organizing Upgrade. So this is a show that's dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent left organizing and activism around the country and beyond for racial and economic justice, as well as so much more. Stay tuned for future episodes of Frontline Dispatches every Wednesday. That's 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Pacific time. So my name is Jayanni Webster, and I will be your host today. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please leave comments and chats in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those as the show goes on. Also, if you haven't yet, give Organizing Upgrade a like and subscribe to this channel. And finally, to stay up to date and to stay up to speed with all of the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, you can sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. Okay, let's get into it. So I'm super excited tonight to be talking with someone who is coming out of the labor movement, because the labor movement is very close to my heart. So my guest today is Luke Elliott-Negri, who is a union activist based in New York, and also also is a contributor to Organizing Upgrade. So we're going to go ahead and kick off the interview and just allow Luke to tell us a little bit more about what's happening in New York. So we know that the New York legislative session just kicked off amidst a growing budget crisis. Luke, can you tell us more about this particular crisis, what has contributed to it, and why should we care? Why does it matter?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here chatting with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So, I think obviously on the whole planet and in the whole society, like we're in a moment right now. I just keep feeling like this is a moment. I'm not one to try to predict the future, but I do feel like it is possible that we're seeing a kind of an exit hatch from the neoliberal paradigm we've been in for the last 40 or 50 years, and we're seeing the president put forward platforms that are, I think, far beyond what have been his politics historically, and that are to the left of, to President Obama when Biden was his vice president. So it just feels to me like a moment when the paradigm is shifting a bit. And so the way that that's playing out here in New York is that we've had decades of Republican control of the state Senate in New York. Basically forever. The kind of lines that were drawn in kind of 81 basically baked in the system that we had through 2018. And in 2018, those midterms were brutal for the Republican Party in New York. It was a good deal. And also I won't get into the weeds for the viewers, but there was a pretty exceptional situation in New York where there was a thing called the Independent Democratic Conference from basically 2011 through 2018, where Democratic legislators were effectively caucusing with Republicans and keeping the Senate in Republican control. And that was busted up in 2018 as well. So a bunch of primary challenges to those nominal Democrats, and then a general election rout. And so there was a really big policy year in 2019. A lot of stuff got done, but the biggest thing that got done was pretty radical rent law reforms in New York, in New York State. Like if you go to the real estate organs, they claim to have lost, collectively billions of dollars. And of course, the effect for normal people is they're less likely to get evicted. I mean, that is what the net of it is, right? But that happened. Then coronavirus happened in 2020, and so that cycle kind of got washed out. I mean, I think. I don't want to say nothing got done, but it was just a rough cycle, and it was timed with, the electoral cycle in New York, and people were figuring out petitioning. It was just chaos. And so I feel like right now we're in the middle of, a substantial budget deficit that, hopefully the federal government will deal with some of that. But we're also here in New York with just an incredible tax base. We have incredible wealth in this state. We have, just an incredible number of high income earners. And so we have here the ability to do the kind of aspirational, like a New Deal style projects that some states, unfortunately, like don't have the set of just the tax base to pull off that sort of program. And so this cycle, we've got a whole new group of legislators, but also I would say some legislators who've been around in some cases for decades, who've been also waiting for a moment like this, when Democrats have super majoritarian control in both chambers. And so there is a coalition called Invest in Our New York that's going in for $50 billion in new taxes. In round numbers, the state's operating budget is about $180 billion. So it's, a substantial increase. And there's a whole range of needs, that money would and should go to. And so, look, it's a really exciting moment in which we could really see some transformation in New York State and see the kind of, at least proto New Deal style stuff that, for example, FDR was able to do when he was the governor shortly before he became the president in the wake of the Great Depression. But I think hopefully grander this time around. So that's a little bit of context for what's going on in New York. There's a lot of exciting young legislators heading up to Albany and some people who've been around for a while too, who I think are poised to do some exciting work.
Wow. So we have this coalition, Invest in Our New York, going after $50 billion that's going to be moved into the public sector. And so what you're talking about, Luke, has broadly been defined as like a tax on the rich, basically. And we know that particular demand is not new. We kind of heard it echoed in the presidential primaries, particularly when Bernie was in the field. And we've seen different initiatives across the country to fight for fair taxation systems. What do you believe is very promising about the Invest in Our New York push? What's different about what you all think that you can do in this moment?
I mean, it is a wonderful group of people, so I'll say that. I mean, there's a link to drop somewhere, and there you go. It's up. It's up now, so that's great. So if you scroll down to the bottom there, you can see the 6 revenue bills that the coalition is pushing, but also you can click to expand the broad statewide list of organizations that are affiliated with the coalition, labor unions, community organizations, just across the spectrum. So I think there's just a lot of focus across all the different issue groups in the state right now on this as being kind of fundamental to their work, to the work that needs to get done. Plays out differently for different constituencies. I mean, I'm more familiar with the public sector agencies that need substantial resources, but there are many, many different services that the state could and should be providing more fully than it has. And so I would just say there is a broad coalition of organizations. Taxing the well-off is like quite popular even among the Republican electorate that remains in New York State and across the country, right? I mean, it is broadly popular to do this, and I also think that having had this history of the IDC primary challenges of some of the DSA candidates that are headed to Albany, it just creates a certain sense of momentum and accountability and need to execute things in a serious way and not just duck run and do what can be done. But like I said, I also have this feeling that like New York has been under a very specific political arrangement for decades.
Right.
That arrangement shifted, and there was a brief window in which those rent laws happened, and then we had the coronavirus. So the other piece of this puzzle is, like I was just talking to a colleague about this earlier today, but I feel like in some sense, we don't know anyone. We don't know any of these legislators really, because they have had to operate on a very specific terrain. And we are all in the middle of this crisis adjusting to the fact that that terrain is gone. Like, the Republican Party has been eviscerated in New York State. And even under the Biden midterms, there may be, they may pick up a seat or two, but like the days of kind of split chambers is just, it's over, right? And we're going to be, redrawing the lines in the Senate. They were gerrymandered in the early 80s and stayed that way. And so it's some of the people who've been around, some of the new people, it's the coalition, and it's also just the moment. It is the moment, right? And there are people going to get their food from food pantries across New York City in lines, this is I don't want to overstate the comparison to the 1930s, because we've actually built some semblance of a welfare state in the United States. So it's it is not the same as it was then, but some of the objective material conditions that New Yorkers and everyone on the planet and the society are facing are horrifying. And, I just think there is a broad sense that we've got to act right now. So I think we'll get something done, but we'll see.
Yeah, and you are acting, and you are being a very important example, I think, for other states and other coalitional efforts. I live in Tennessee. A few years back, they enshrined in our state constitution that we cannot have an income tax ever. It's in the Constitution. So what you all are able to do and take advantage of in this political moment is really inspiring. And so for those of us who are just joining, again, I'm talking with Luke Elliott-Negri, who is a union activist in New York, about an initiative called Invest in Our New York, broadly trying to tax the rich in order to make sure we can have more money for the social good of our communities. So if you're in the audience, please drop your questions in the chat and we will have our guests answer them. Luke, I want to kind of turn our attention to the opposition here. So you're saying the Republican Party has been, eviscerated in New York State. Well, who is putting up the opposition? What are the challenges do you see in passing the Invest in Our New York Act or the set of bills that you all are considering?
I think, one of the big dynamics over the last stretch of months as the crisis has unfolded, I think these conversations, trying to think what the state of things was as the coronavirus kicked off. Again, I think we kind of lost a legislative cycle to the early phase of that crisis. So in New York, the budget cycle runs through April 1st. And so we were all just kind of processing the pandemic and trying to survive and manage that lockdown. And, a couple of legislators got coronavirus. It was very difficult. There has been a more focused conversation on taxation in the second half of the year. And I think one of the dynamics, which, can be both an excuse to avoid making tough decisions, but also is a reality, is that, there's been a kind of sense from the top of New York State, from the executive, from the leadership in the chambers, that we don't want to act too early and raise a bunch of taxes and then avoid receiving support from the federal government if we've basically covered our deficit here. So that has been one of the conversations. But I would say that what the coalition is pushing for, our deficit is not $50 billion, right? Our deficit is, depending on who you talk to, and every number is political, even if you've got a very smart person who's crunching the numbers in a spreadsheet, between $10 and $15 billion in shortfall. But what we're up to right now is not just filling that shortfall. We're saying that, we've been under austerity, neoliberal governance for decades. We've, frankly, in New York, been under, there's been substantial Republican control of the state, which is, there's a set of politics that those folks had and a base that they were accountable to that, hampered the state from doing the kind of, the kind of taxation that is necessary to, have not just a well-functioning state, but a state that can be a model for let me pause and say, the planet is burning. That is where we're at, right? We've got a short period of time in front of us, and either we're all going to throw down as human beings in whatever municipalities or states or countries that we find ourselves in to sort out how not to burn this planet to the ground, or we're not going to do that. And so I think right now this coalition is saying, look, this is not the time to fill a little shortfall and go back to normal. This is the time to get outside of the normal that we've been inside of and build something truly new and different that reflects the moment that we're in historically, right? Historically, in terms of just the politics of the society and the level of polarization that we've reached, but also in terms of this planet's ability to hold human life, come on, this is the moment to act. And so, my hope is that we can come out of this cycle, with some like national media on New York saying, look, here is a real like serious aspirational model, one that the federal government, I mean, I actually hope we're following the federal government. We'll see what Biden can pull off, what Bernie can pull off, what Joe Manchin is able and willing to do. We'll see what happens in DC. So, I mean, ideally we're following them, but the other piece of the story may be that there's a couple states that are able to do something that is drastically beyond what we have in the neoliberal era thought of states being capable of. And so I hope New York is one of those states. We'll see.
Yeah, excellent. I want to focus now on the coalition that you're bringing together. Sure. And you're labor activists, and this is a broad coalition of many different organizations, community and labor and political groups. What's the role of labor and labor unions in this fight? How is that manifested?
Yeah, so I think there's a mix, right? We've got a number of like substantial labor unions who are formally signed on to the coalition's platform. And I think some more to come from some of the conversations I've had. And then we have some labor unions that for various reasons, right? I mean, just to step back and say it's kind of the nature of strong labor unions that they manage, inside relationships and have institutional interests that they're protecting. And so there's just some calculations there for some parts of organized labor, which is not to say that the bulk of organized labor is opposed to anything that's going on. Those who are not in this coalition are, in fact, organizing with and for some of the very same bills that are in the coalition, but are making some political calculations just based on their needs and interests and their members. And, that is part of the nature of having power, in my view, right? And it's, something, that I think the left, which has been on the decline for a bunch of decades and now is, in some kind of resurgent moment, needs to grapple with. When you have a bunch of power, there are, there are calculations to make when you wield that power. And so I think, the labor movement is both in and out of this coalition in New York. And, but again, I would think even that those are out are pushing, in their own ways for the very same kind of forms of tax increase that are the kind of centerpiece of the coalition. Yeah, so that's, I guess, a short answer and, maybe a broad one, but yeah.
Definitely appreciate that. And thinking about like the political calculations that labor has to make in fights like these. So I do want to just, continue to encourage our audience to please drop your questions in the chat so that we can have time to answer them. I want to also just kind of think to what you're saying about New York being a model for other states and other places. How long have y'all been in this particular fight to tax the rich in New York? And what are some of the lessons that are coming out for you that you think you can share, like,
sure,
across the country?
I mean, depends who's watching, but I think one lesson for the left, right, which can sometimes be critical of our, coalitional allies inside the Democratic Party, understandably so, is that you need Democratic majorities, to have a terrain on which these fights are possible to wage. And so the last time that New York State increased the marginal tax rate on high income earners was in 2009. It was a not dissimilar moment. Very briefly, I said that this kind of arrangement of Republican control goes back to, the 81 basically. But in fact, there was a narrow window in 2009 when Democrats, I guess in the 2008 elections, they took control. And in the 2009 cycle, they raised about $5 billion in taxes on high income earners with a sunset clause. That was part of the deal at the time. We're not in for that this time, I will tell you. I think some of that revenue has been lost because of that sunset clause, but some has been protected. But that was, and I will say, it was a very tenuous majority at the time. More might have happened in the 2009 and 2010 cycles in New York if the control of the chamber had not been so tenuous. The kind of roots of that, I mentioned that IDC, the Independent Democratic Conference that effectively kept Republicans in control of the state Senate from 2011 to 2018. In 2009, there was what was called the coup, when three Democratic legislators switched sides of the aisle and basically like put Republicans in control of the chamber. And literally there ended up being, the question of who was physically in control of the chamber and who had the keys to the chamber, the literal space, was at stake for this like strange stretch of days and weeks. So it was very narrow control, but, it was control. And that was the terrain on which, a bunch of players, including many who were involved in this coalition, pushed to raise about $5 billion in taxes. And this time around, we have super majoritarian control, which is not to say that every member of the Democratic Conference is like our perfect ally and all our politics are all aligned. No, that's not what it is. But there is a political party that has majoritarian control, and there's a set of incentives that come with that control, and a set of possibilities for those of us in the movement to push and to win things on the basis of that control. And so, I don't want to overstate it, but I fear on the left there's a tendency to understate, the terrain that creates, the terrain that majoritarian party control creates for coalitions like Invest in Our New York to make real claims on the wealth that has accrued privately in this state, and to take that wealth and apply it to the social good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for drawing that out in terms of like how these moments, these electoral moments, can present opportunities and not just completely writing them off. And we do have a question from the chat from Max. So they ask, is tax the rich an issue in the way of the New York City mayoral race and how it's shaping up? Are any of the candidates throwing down with this thinking, and will it help their campaign?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is, so here's a weird thing about New York. New York City has its own income tax, but the income tax rate in New York City is controlled by the state, and it actually is a more regressive income tax than the state's income tax. But with many things, New York City lacks home rule. And so there's been a real strategic calculation on the part of the coalition to make this a statewide issue and to talk about generating tax revenue at the state level, and this weird quirk that the New York City income tax is more regressive than the state income tax is not like a major kind of platform piece in the coalition. And to be honest, even the mayor with that executive control, even with super majoritarian control, I think there's one or two Republicans left in the New York City Council. But there's just a lot less that the council and that the mayor can do in terms of revenue raising than the state can do. It has a leeway with property taxes, so that's a place where the city can act in creative and interesting ways. But all of the central planks of the coalition are state focused, and so. I would have to, I guess, I'm sorry to say I don't have like thorough knowledge of what position folks have taken on this, but I actually feel like, if they're really campaigning on what is possible and for them to do as mayor, this is just not, it's not in the wheelhouse of the New York City mayor, even though the New York City mayor deals with an $80 billion budget, has a lot less control over revenue than state legislators do. So it's not like a fulcrum issue, in the city races the way it is for, even a random assembly race at the state level where this is really, high salience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. And so I want to kind of think about just beyond the even phrase tax the rich. What would it look like if you won this fight? Like, what would it do for everyday folks in New York? Like, how does the coalition explain the impact of passing this act and these set of bills? Like, what would it look like?
Yeah, let me just dive into an example that I've been reading about that's near and dear to my heart. So I work at the City University of New York, which was, founded as the free college in the 19th century. And was free to New Yorkers. If you were a resident of New York, you could get a free bachelor's degree from the mid 19th century. I'm going to butcher the year, 1847. I think the Free College was founded. Forgive me if that's the wrong year to my CUNY historians who might be watching this. Through the 1975 fiscal crisis, you could get a free bachelor's degree. So I go crazy. I go crazy when I hear these national conversations. Could we do it? Could we get free college? It's so crazy. Like, for more than a century in New York, you could get a free bachelor's degree for more than a century. I mean, many people who are living and working in New York now got their bachelor's degree for free in the early 1970s and the late 1960s. There's 1.5 million, 4 million CUNY alums floating around New York, a substantial portion of whom got their bachelor's degree pre-1975 when it was free. I've been reading and thinking about this moment of transition when CUNY started charging tuition. And, here's the dynamic. Here's what was going on in like the late 60s and early 70s. People of color in New York were organized, right? It was the civil rights era. It was Black power. And they were demanding access to the same resources that white people got, working class white people got in New York City. That was what was going on in the late 60s and early 70s. So there was a big fight in the late 60s for open admissions at CUNY, which is to say, if you get a high school degree from a New York City public school, you can come to a CUNY college and you can get your bachelor's degree there. And that fight led to much broader access to people of color, to the City University of for people of color to the City University of New York. And you know what? I mean, that CUNY is one piece, but this was happening for social services across the city, services that had been provided to white people for a long time. You had people of color in the city demanding access to those resources. And so what did elected officials do at the time? They said, I feel a little uncomfortable raising taxes on my white, wealthy constituents to fund the same services we've been funding for white people, but for people of color, right? So I think racism is baked into the story of how we got to the moment that we're in New York right now. And so what did New York City do? Absent its own control to deal with revenue, it went to banks and it financed the services. I mean, the demand was so strong, the movements were so strong that in fact the access happened, but it happened, by basically funding it off of loans that they couldn't repay to the financial industry in New York. And that was what the fiscal crisis was. It was an unwillingness on the part of white elected officials to raise taxes on wealthy, mostly white people in New York State to fund services that they had funded for white people, but not for people of color. Like that's what the story of the fiscal crisis was. And that was, the very moment that CUNY was becoming a majority minority population, majority POC population, was the moment when they started to charge tuition, and which the decline in state investment is basically for the last, since 75 has been on the decline, right? The per student investment has gone down. So there's many ways to tell the story, but one of them is straight up racism. Like that's what this story is. And like, this is a moment in which we can reverse that basically horrifying story. And about CUNY specifically, there's this, like, from open admissions in the late 60s through 75, there was this moment when CUNY was really for everyone, and it was decently funded, and it was tuition free. Like, that happened, and it can happen again. So that's just one example. There's a lot else, right? Because there was many other versions of that story that happened in the early 1970s that led to, basically funding city services through the financial sector rather than through raising taxes, leading to the financial crisis, and then leading to the, evisceration or the gradual decline of those services. Sorry, I got kind of worked up, but I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, I'm just like, I just feel like this is a moment. So on the optimistic side, this is a moment when we can reverse that. That history lives with us today in all of the city and states institutions. That history lives with us today, and we can flip it. Like, this is the moment. And like, I don't want to say it's not rocket science. It's like tax wealth and put it to these services, and we're done. Like, we're not done, but we can clean up a lot of that mess.
Absolutely, Luke. Thank you so much for even pulling back the layers of what's happening today and connecting it to this historical moment of where, the white elite in New York decided that they were going to basically cut off resources for everyone due to racism and not wanting Black people and other people of color to have access to the shared resources of the community in New York and of public resources. And so I think that story is played out in lots of different ways all across the country for decades and decades. And so appreciate you lifting up the racial justice lens of this fight as well. So we're approaching the end of our time. And so to our audience, if you enjoyed this video, stay up to speed with all of the amazing content that is coming out of Organizing Upgrade that Luke himself is contributing to. And you can sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. So I want to again thank you, Luke, and want to see if you have any closing thoughts on today's program.
No, just a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks so much for hosting and asking great questions. And yeah, it was just a pleasure. And hopefully we could chat again in a few months with some good news.
We would love to invite you back on to talk about the victory. So we're with you all the way. So thank you to everyone who was able to tune in tonight. Thank you to our production team at Organizing Upgrade. And please, again, join us next week. Same day, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and of course, 4 p.m. Pacific time. We're here. We're talking about left strategy and grassroots organizing and campaigns on the ground. Would love to see you next week. Have a good night, everyone.